So welcome to the Soils Unit Lesson 2, and that is soil in the garden. And in this session we are going to talk about soils in your garden as well as in your raised beds and containers. So following up from where we started at the last lesson, which was talking about what is soil, now we're going to talk about how plants use soil and how you can take care of the soil that you have. So plants depend on soil to provide for their four basic needs. Number one, anchorage, holding them in place, keeping them in the ground. But also plants are getting almost all of their water through their plant roots, which means that they're through the pore spaces in the soil that are holding water. Also the oxygen. Plants are getting all of their oxygen from their roots, and so there has to be air pockets in the soil. And 13 of the 16 essential nutrients that plants need are absorbed by the root hairs in solution in soil. So really plants depend on soil for almost everything they need to survive and grow. So we tend to pay a lot of attention to what's happening above ground with our plants because that's the part that we can see, but so much more is happening that is essential below ground. So how do we amend and protect our soil? Hardly any of us are blessed with the perfect soil, whether it's the perfect soil texture or structure or a soil that is naturally rich in organic matter. So generally we are going to be working as gardeners to make our soil better and then protecting the resource that we have created. So we can amend with raw organic materials. So this is anything from leaf clippings to straw to grass clippings to compost, animal manures from livestock, not pets. Any of these kinds of materials can be used to increase the organic matter in our soils, though we want to be really careful that we use certain materials in a safe way. Also, anything that you're bringing in, whether it's leaves or grass clippings or straw or hay or compost, you want to make sure that it is clean, that it's as weed-free as possible, and that it has not been contaminated with any kind of pesticide, especially some sort of weed killer. Some of them can be very persistent and can actually really harm your garden rather than help it. And if you're talking about putting in manures, especially fresh manures, those should only be added to your soil in the fall so that they have time to age and break down a little bit throughout the winter. And that will kill some of the disease-causing pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella that can be transferred by those materials. So again, with compost, compost is a wonderful way to enrich your soil, build organic matter, and bring all those wonderful benefits. However, you can do too much of a good thing, especially if you're using a lot of manure-based compost, like a lot of the dairy manure compost that's available in the southern and eastern part of the state. These can often be very high in salts, and they can raise the salt content of your soil if you use too much. However, if you have access to a really nice forest-based compost or a mushroom compost, you can add lots and lots of that with very, very few risks. Cover crops and green manures can be a little bit higher level of soil fertility management and organic matter building. Often takes some training and expertise in the know-how to do cover crops and green manures, and these are really just things that you grow in the garden that are not going to be harvested but are just going to be turned back into the soil, either for their nutrient capacity or maybe their pest fighting properties, and sometimes they're just something to keep cover on the soil so that you don't lose soil to water or wind erosion. But again, the timing of that is really important, and we can certainly connect you with a resource on how to use cover crops in a garden setting, but more and more catalogs and garden centers are selling cover crop seeds in the amounts that might be needed for a home garden. A little bit about tillage. In some cases, tillage is very important to incorporate residues, to mix the soil, to get it ready for planting, and sometimes to control weeds. But you can also overuse it and cause some problems. And we'll look at some photos of all of these things here in a minute. And then the use of mulches. Mulches can be a very beneficial aid to you as a gardener, both in making your soil happier and healthier and also making a little bit less work for you. So let's look at some examples. So this is where a little bit of compost is being used as a mulch around this new zucchini plant. So you can see that the drip irrigation is going to help keep that compost in place. It's not going to get washed away. And this compost is doing a few different things. So it's going to be feeding the soil. It's going to be feeding the soil microorganisms, and it's also creating a little bit of an insulation around that plant. So tillage, you may have everything from a very, very small, lightweight mantis tiller up to a a big rear tine tiller like this guy, or even something that you pull behind a lawn tractor like one of the smaller John Deeres. Tillage, again, can be a really beneficial thing for working cover crop residues in, or cleaning up the garden, preparing a nice smooth seed bed, and weeding between beds. However, the more we till, the more we disrupt the soil microbial life, and the more that we actually pulverize and do away with that soil structure. So use tillage as an important tool, but not one that that you overuse. And also, if you are going to be tilling, take really, really good care that you don't till when your soil is wet. If you can put your soil into a ball in your hand, and when you release your hand the soil stays in a ball at all, it is too wet to till, and what will happen is you'll create enormous clods that will not break down until the following year. So just really hold off on tilling until that soil is mostly dry. And here's an example of using mulch in the garden, and the mulch does a few things. So it's insulating the soil against water loss and temperature fluctuations, which can really help with a lot of different plant problems related to stress. And then also, the more you have a mulch on the open ground, the less likely you are to have weeds that sprout and grow. So this is just using a clean straw mulch. Again, not all mulches are created equal. You can use grass clippings, you can use straw, hay, even cardboard, but just be sure that the material you're using is clean, free of weed seeds, and free of chemical contaminants. And just general care for the soil. Your plants will often give you clues to what your soil might be lacking. If they're starting to turn yellow, or if they're stunted, sometimes they might even show deformities. These can all be signs of either nutrient imbalances, nutrient toxicities, contamination. So watching your plants for signs. Healthy plant growth is going to happen when you have healthy soils. And just really try not to overwork your soil, and whatever you're taking out, put back in the form of organic matter. So that was mostly talking about your garden soil. What if you're gardening in a raised bed? Well, you have a few different options. So if your soil is actually in pretty good shape, but you're just looking for some of the benefits of a raised bed garden, you can simply amend your native soil with compost and then mound it up into formed beds. And that can work really well in some parts of the state. If you're actually constructing a raised bed, and there's going to be a lot more about this next unit, you want to create that perfect blend of soil. So typically you're going to be mixing topsoil, maybe some peat moss, and then absolutely some compost, so that you can have that nice, lightweight, nutrient-rich soil in your boxes and beds. Another way to do this is called lasagna gardening, and there are some great resources available online and lots of pictures of how this works. This typically is more effective in the wetter parts of the state where you get a lot of rain or snowfall. And so what you do is you would just start by layering cardboard, compost, leaves, straw, and you make this lasagna structure, which over time breaks down and gives you a really nice composted, fertile place to grow. So this can be a great option if you have limited space, but you have access to all of these sorts of materials. And again, can't say this enough, be sure all your materials are clean, weed-free, and high quality. Especially if we're growing in a raised bed, skimping on the soil is where you should not skimp, because that is going to be supporting your plant growth for the next foreseeable future. Here's an example of just that amending and mounding of native soil into a raised bed. So you get some of the benefits of the plants being a little bit higher up, which better drainage, a little bit warmer temperatures, and this picture is also showing the use of mulches. And in this case, the mulch is clean grass clippings that have not been sprayed. So here's a classic example of raised beds at a community garden, and again, next unit we'll talk more about the design, construction, and building of raised beds. But you can see that they've removed the grass. That's not always necessary, especially if your raised bed is tall. That grass under 8 to 10 to 12 inches of topsoil is going to break down. But this has just made it easier for them to manage, and you'll see that they did put down some mulch here in a minute. But this soil mix is a mix of topsoil and compost, and If you don't ever stand on the beds, then you typically don't ever have to till these either. You would just fluff them with a fork or a shovel and add new compost every year. Though some gardeners have found that the use of a lightweight mantis tiller in the beds can be really nice for just mixing things up, or if they grow a very small cover crop. And so here again is showing a mulch around those garden boxes. This can really help with some of the weeds. I do see a few weeds sprouting up in this picture, but also for keeping the ground dry and less muddy for working around the beds. So what about containers? So here we have a little bit more specialized need. Just keep in mind when we're growing in a container, just about anything can be used as long as it didn't formerly hold any kind of toxic material. Any container that we use, though, we need to provide drainage holes. If it doesn't come with them, then punch them out or hammer them out. Rocks and stones at the bottom are not a sufficient substitute for holes. There needs to be a way for that water to freely drain. And then it is always better to err on the side of overestimating the size requirement you're going to need for a container. Little too soil, you're going to have poor root growth and development and subsequently poor yields up top. And in a container, topsoil can sometimes be too heavy, as well as garden soil. It can compact and become really hard for roots to penetrate. So looking at a high quality commercial potting mix might be your best option. And a lot of them now come with fertilizers already embedded in them. You might want to be very selective about that. We have found that a lot of seedlings especially and some vegetables don't seem to do really well in that fertilizer mix. It's often too strong. So you could either mix potting soil with fertilizer with potting soil that does not have it. Our favorite mix, though, is just a plain potting soil mixed with about 50% good compost in your containers, and that really gives you a lot of nutrients and a little bit of the biological activity that would normally be missing because potting mix is not alive like soil. Also, when you're growing in containers, those containers they're really an artificial environment, so fertilizer becomes really necessary. Once plants have used up the nutrients in that compost, you'll want to use a slow release or water soluble fertilizer in that container. So here's just a picture to remind you that while almost any container with drainage can be used, and some can be rather clever, you really need to give your plants enough soil that they can grow and develop. Something like this repurposed shoe tree could be very cute for very small plants or tiny flowers, but for the most part, those plants are not going to have enough rooting depth. And this is a much better example. You have one tomato in about a 5-gallon container, and that's just about right for each plant. You could probably even go bigger. And you can see they've used a commercial potting mix. You see the little white bits of perlite and the little glints of vermiculite that come in a commercial potting mix. This is going to be lightweight, fast draining, and allow for optimal root growth. Alright, so that's it for soils in the garden. I encourage you to go on and choose the soil activities page, work on that, think about how you're going to manage your own soil, and maybe even consider doing a soil test if you feel like you've had soil issues that are holding you back in the garden.